May 8, 1945, arrived not with the anticipated roar of triumph or the echo of final clashes, but with a profound, almost eerie silence across Europe. As dawn gradually unfurled its muted gray light over Bavaria's scarred landscapes, it illuminated a scene of desolation, sodden fields and deserted farmhouses. Along a solitary, winding road, a procession of exhausted figures advanced, their progress marked not by the crisp cadence of marching boots on pavement, but by the soft, sucking slush of shoes through wet earth. These were not the hardened combatants the world typically envisioned. Absent were the expected accoutrements of war. No rifles were slung, no iron helmets glinted in the nascent light. Instead, the column was comprised of young women, their threadbare uniforms, skirts caked with mud up to their knees, armbands bearing faded insignia, a stark testament to their auxiliary roles. Most were scarcely out of their teens or barely into their 20s, their youth belying the grim journey. Some of these women had operated switchboards, their fingers deftly connecting calls that once shaped the war's course. Others had meticulously maintained the ledgers of regiments now vanished into history. A few had even manned anti-aircraft batteries until their ordnance supply dwindled to nothing. Now all moved as captives of an inescapable fate, awaiting whatever justice the victorious powers might deem fit to dispense. Fear, a cold and constant companion, stiffened their weary postures, even as sheer exhaustion threatened to buckle their spines. For years, they had been indoctrinated with dire predictions. That Americans were savage, uncultured, and merciless men who would claim them as spoils of war. They had retold these grim tales in their barracks, half believing them, half desperately hoping they were untrue. But as the Reich disintegrated around them, propaganda blurred into a far more terrifying reality. If the bombs had obliterated their cities and incinerated their neighbors, what conceivable restraint would the men who dropped them show to the women of the vanquished enemy? This harrowing question weighed on their minds more heavily than any physical satchel. Among them walked a girl named Liesel, a mere 21 years old, who had once been a typist for an artillery regiment stationed just outside Munich. Her fingers, which had previously flown across typewriter keys with a speed that often drew scolding glances from slower clerks, now tightly clutched the hem of her mud-splattered skirt. Beside her trudged Marta, 3 years her senior, formerly a telephone operator in a command bunker that no longer existed. Marta's voice had once conveyed coded messages of troop movements. Now she uttered nothing, conserving her words as if silence itself could somehow ensure her safety. A few steps behind, fragile Anna, barely 19, coughed weakly into her sleeve, a persistent ailment born of weeks spent without proper sustenance or shelter. None of them resembled villains. Instead, they appeared as what they truly were, children forced into uniforms by the merciless hand of history. Up ahead, as the road curved, they caught their first glimpse of an American helmet, olive drab against the pale sky. Rifles were cradled, not raised in menace. A small group of soldiers waited. The women froze. From a nearby field, a flock of crows suddenly ascended, their harsh cries filling the profound silence. For a moment, the women were convinced this would be the only sound they would ever hear again. Liesel's lips trembled. Marta whispered a silent prayer. Anna instinctively closed her eyes. The column continued its advance under the barked command of a German sergeant, who still clung to a shred of dignity as fiercely as a drowning man grasps driftwood. The distance steadily narrowed. The faces of the Americans gradually became clearer. Young, sunburned, some in need of shaves, a few idly chewing gum. And then, instead of the shouted curses or anticipated blows, one of the soldiers, barely older than Liesel, did something utterly disorienting. He smiled. It was neither broad nor mocking, but a brief, polite upturn of the lips, much like greeting a neighbor on a quiet morning street. The effect was so profoundly startling that several women instinctively looked away, ashamed of their own profound relief. One soldier raised a hand, not to strike, but to gesture them closer. Another casually tipped his helmet, a gesture absurdly gallant given the stark surroundings. It was as though the world had suddenly tilted on its axis, and the roles they had so rigidly imagined shattered like fragile glass. When the column reached the checkpoint, the German sergeant tersely announced that they were auxiliaries, not combatants. The Americans listened, nodding, diligently noting details in small notebooks. Their English words were brisk, efficient, yet entirely devoid of cruelty. Then came the second shock. A private approached carrying a cardboard box. From it, he carefully extracted wrapped rectangles. Chocolate, the kind that had vanished from German shelves years ago. He distributed them with the same casual motion he might have used at home to offer candy to a cousin. Anna, frail and shivering, stared at the bar in her hands as if it were a forbidden artifact from another planet. Her lips parted, but no words emerged. She bit into it, and tears silently streamed down her cheeks. Not solely for the sweetness, but for the bewildering experience of receiving kindness from the very men she had been told were beasts. The Americans did not initiate conversation, but their remarkable restraint spoke volumes. They then offered bread and hot coffee, the rich aroma of roasted beans drifting across the roadside like a tantalizing taunt to their gnawing hunger. For months, the women had subsisted on watery cabbage or crusts harder than stone. The steam rising from the tin mugs seemed more unreal than the rubble of their demolished cities. Marta accepted hers with careful reverence, her hands trembling so severely that a few drops spilled. She whispered "Danke," unsure if the foreign men understood. The private merely nodded, as if he did. All the while, an unwavering discipline hung over the American camp like a rule carved in stone. No lewd words, no reaching hands, no displays of power beyond the rifles slung across their backs. General Eisenhower had explicitly ordered that prisoners of war, even auxiliaries, were to be treated with dignity under the Geneva Convention. That law, abstract in books and treaties, now took the tangible shape of young men checking lists and methodically handing out rations. It seemed impossible, yet here it was, unfolding on a muddy road on the very day the war was officially declared over. For the women, this abrupt shift was almost unbearable. The enemy, who had been meticulously painted as a monstrous entity, was instead courteous, almost indifferent in his unexpected kindness. The propaganda posters of snarling American beasts were replaced by the sight of a soldier carefully adjusting the strap of his rifle so as not to appear threatening. The silence that settled between captor and captive became heavier than any violence could have been. It forced the women to confront the disturbing possibility that much of what they had been told was fundamentally untrue. Liesl, clutching her ration of bread, stared at the soldier's smile and felt something profoundly fracture within her. For years, she had copied dictations praising the fatherland, typing speeches about defending German honor to the last breath. Now, honor tasted like stale bread softened by hot broth, offered by a stranger in a foreign uniform. She thought of her father, dead in Stalingrad, and wondered what he would think if he saw her being fed by an American. Would he be ashamed, or would he be relieved that at least someone had spared his daughter? As dusk approached, the women were gently herded toward a truck bound for an internment camp. The Americans gave brief, clear instructions, pointing to the vehicle and ensuring order without resorting to threats. The air carried the faint scent of gasoline and wet earth, but also, paradoxically, the lingering fragrance of coffee and chocolate still melting on their tongues. The women climbed aboard, their minds reeling with bewildering contradictions. Marta leaned toward Liesl and whispered, "If this is captivity, then what was freedom?" Liesl had no answer. She only tightened her grip on the ration she dared not finish, as if proof of this unexpected kindness might vanish if she ate it all. The truck rattled forward, its wheels kicking up mud, carrying them away from the road where their old world had irrevocably ended. Behind them, the American soldiers stood watch, rifles slung, their faces calm and impassive. Anna looked back once and caught another fleeting smile from the private who had given her chocolate. It was not triumph, not pity, just a small, distinctly human acknowledgement. That glimpse unsettled her more deeply than cruelty ever could, for in that moment, the true battle began. Not one of armies or guns, but of memory and entrenched belief. These women had been raised to fear monsters. Instead, they had encountered men who offered food, warmth, and disciplined courtesy. And as the truck jolted into the distance, they carried not the scars of violence, but the profoundly disarming weight of kindness. Yet what that kindness truly signified, and how it would reshape their understanding of everything they had once believed, was a question that would haunt them far longer than the war itself. The truck eventually rattled to a stop inside a camp rimmed with barbed wire, its posts leaning like weary sentinels against the spring wind. The women climbed down slowly, their boots sinking into the damp soil, their breaths visible in the chill of the evening air. Floodlights flickered on, casting long, stark shadows across the compound. They braced themselves for shouting, perhaps even blows, for this was the place where fear had relentlessly told them kindness would surely end. Instead, they were met by silence, a disciplined, watchful silence, as American guards directed them with measured gestures. No hands grabbed their arms. No insults pierced the cool air. The quietness itself unnerved them more profoundly than any overt threat. Rows of utilitarian wooden barracks stretched ahead, their walls emitting the faint, clean scent of fresh pine and the comforting smell of smoke from nearby cookstoves. The camp, though Spartan, was practical, not cruel. The women exchanged uncertain glances as they were lined up for registration. Liesl stood stiffly, her eyes darting nervously from the wire fence to the watchtower, meticulously noting every detail as if her mind required concrete proof she was still alive. Marta whispered under her breath, counting the guards, her old operator's habit of scanning for signals instinctively resurfacing. Anna swayed slightly, too weak to conceal her profound fatigue, and one of the guards, a man with sandy hair, gently gestured for her to step aside. Her heart lurched, instantly expecting punishment. Instead, he led her to a simple bench, placed a tin cup of water in her trembling hands, and walked away without uttering a single word. She stared at the rippling surface of the water in the cup as though it were sorcery. The intake officers, their expressions neutral, asked questions in clipped English, which were translated haltingly by an interpreter. Name, age, role, location of service. Liesl answered with rigid precision, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. When she stated typist, the interpreter merely nodded, as if this one word explained everything about her. Marta admitted she had manned telephone lines, her voice breaking slightly as she recalled the endless streams of coded chatter that now seemed utterly meaningless. Anna barely spoke, only whispering, Krankenschwesterhelferin, nurse's helper, in German, which the interpreter translated gently. Their answers were recorded in ledgers with the soft scratch of pens, not the accusatory bark of shouts. The formality felt almost respectful, and that very civility made them feel exposed in a way cruelty never could. After registration, they were directed toward a barack. Inside, rough wooden bunks lined the walls, each equipped with straw mattresses covered by coarse but unmistakably clean blankets. The air carried the faint, almost miraculous smell of disinfectant and real soap, unmistakable and exceedingly rare. Each woman stood frozen, as though afraid to touch the bedding, until a guard placed a small bar of soap on the nearest table. It was wrapped in paper stamped with English words they could not decipher. Liesl lifted it cautiously, sniffed it, and her throat tightened at the sharp, clean scent. Real soap, something she had not held since before the bombs reduced her home to rubble. Marta's hands trembled as she rubbed the edge of the bar with her thumb, as if the object itself might dematerialize. For women who had scrubbed themselves with only cold water and sand, this humble square of soap carried the weight of a profound miracle. Then came supper. The women filed into a mess hall where steam rose from large vats of food, filling the air with a richness that made their stomachs twist in agonizing anticipation. Tin trays were handed down the line, each one generously filled with bread, bacon, potatoes, and, most astonishing of all, real coffee. The smell alone nearly undid them. Anna pressed her face close to her tray, her eyes glistening at the sight of meat that glistened with fat. Marta chewed slowly, reverently, as though afraid a single bite might be her last. Liesl, who had long trained herself to swallow watery cabbage without complaint, felt tears burn her eyes when the soft bread melted in her mouth. No speech from Goebbels had ever felt so powerful as that taste. The guards ate alongside them at separate tables, but without any theatrical displays of superiority. They laughed quietly among themselves, passing salt shakers and pouring coffee. The contrast was almost unbearable. Enemies breaking bread within sight, yet seemingly untouched by hatred. Some of the women dared to glance over, curious despite themselves. One young soldier caught Anna's gaze and offered a polite smile before returning to his meal. She looked away quickly, her heart hammering, profoundly confused by a gesture that felt both ordinary and utterly incomprehensible. Night arrived, and the women lay in their bunks, listening to the steady hum of generators and the distant clank of boots on gravel. For the first time in months, they lay under blankets without the terrifying dread of bombs overhead. Yet sleep would not come easily. Each carried the immense weight of questions pressing heavier than the blankets themselves. Was this a trick? Would the kindness vanish once their usefulness ended? Or worse, what if it did not vanish? What if it remained, forcing them to reckon with the disturbing possibility that the enemy was not what they had been told? Liesl whispered into the dark, her voice barely carrying, "They treat us better than our own officers." Marta, lying on the bunk above, remained silent for a long moment before finally replying, "That is what frightens me most." Anna curled in the corner, clutching her bar of soap as though it were a sacred relic, and whispered prayers to a god she had nearly forgotten. Days passed and patterns began to form. Each morning they were given bread and porridge, sometimes fruit, sometimes jam. Guards addressed them not with insults, but with a formal, unwavering courtesy. Discipline remained strict. There was barbed wire, roll calls, curfews. But the cruelty they had braced for never arrived. Instead, there was routine, cleanliness, sufficient food, and something surprisingly close to dignity. Liesl found herself walking with her shoulders less hunched. Marta allowed herself to speak again, quietly to the others. Anna's cough eased, though confusion only deepened in her eyes. And yet, fear lingered not from violence, but from the terrifying collapse of certainty. Their lives had been shaped by relentless warnings of barbarity, by stories of Americans who would burn and kill without mercy. To find smiles instead of snarls, rations instead of rags, made them question the very ground they stood on. It was as if the soil of their beliefs was turning to treacherous mud beneath their feet. Each unexpected act of kindness struck them harder than any cruelty would have. On the fifth night, as they returned from the mess hall, a fierce storm broke across the sky. Rain hammered the barracks roof. Thunder rolled, shaking the very foundations, and the women huddled near the narrow windows. Outside, guards hurried through the downpour, their ponchos glistening in the flashes of lightning. One young soldier paused near the wire, turned, and saw the women watching. He lifted his hand in a casual wave, his face briefly illuminated by a striking bolt of lightning. It was a gesture so small, so inherently human, that it pierced deeper than any sermon could have. Marta drew in a sharp breath. "Why would they do that?" she whispered. Liesl had no answer, only the unsettling sense that the enemy's unexpected humanity was unraveling something vital inside her. Anna pressed her palm to the cold glass as if to hold the fleeting moment still. The thunder continued to shake the barracks, but it was the profound silence afterward that carried the most weight. the silence of women slowly realizing that mere survival was not the only shock awaiting them. What they did not yet know was that these small gestures, these bars of soap and polite smiles, were not accidental circumstances, but part of a larger code, a discipline enforced from the highest command. And that discipline, born of policy and principle, would soon transform from simple acts of courtesy into something far more unsettling. A mirror that reflected back the stark truth of the lies they had been taught. The rhythm of captivity slowly settled into the women's bones, but it did not bring peace. Each dawn began with roll call, boots on gravel, names spoken into the morning mist. The Americans' voices carried no anger, only routine, and that was the first, most subtle disorientation. Liesl stood in line with the others, her posture rigid from years of habit, but her eyes betrayed the fracture widening inside her. She had expected every day to be a relentless struggle for survival, and yet survival here was undeniably easier than freedom had been in Germany's final, desperate months. Bread was plentiful, soap was real, blankets were warm, and still, the strangeness of it pressed down on her like a storm cloud refusing to break. Marta felt it too. She caught herself watching the guards when she thought no one noticed, subtly studying their mannerisms. One soldier polished his boots in the afternoon sun, humming a tune that vaguely reminded her of a waltz she had once danced to in Vienna before the war stole her laughter. Another leaned against a post, reading a folded letter with such tenderness in his face that Marta felt like an intrusive observer. Were these truly the monsters they had been so vehemently warned about? She wanted to hate them. She wanted the propaganda to be true because that would, at least, make sense of her shattered world. Instead, every ordinary gesture, laughter over coffee, a patient demeanor at roll call, turned her understanding inside out. Anna, the youngest, seemed most profoundly undone by it all. Her body slowly mended under the steady, nourishing meals, her cheeks gradually filling out, but her mind wavered. At night, she whispered questions that no one could possibly answer. Why do they treat us kindly? What if kindness is the weapon? She had grown up believing in a Germany that demanded unwavering sacrifice, and she had braced herself for unrelenting cruelty. Kindness was not a mercy to her. It was a riddle too complex, too unsettling to solve. She clutched her bar of soap each night as if it might offer an explanation, the paper wrapping fraying beneath her restless fingers. The camp itself became a bizarre theater of contradictions. The barbed wire stood tall, its sharp edges glinting under the floodlights, yet no beatings echoed within its borders. Guards carried rifles, yet their voices remained calm, devoid of menace. The women were prisoners, yet they were cleaner, better nourished, and safer than they had been in their final months of nominal freedom. The paradox gnawed at them. Marta remarked one evening, half to herself, "Our cages are kinder than our homes." The words hung heavy in the barracks, no one daring to openly agree, no one daring to deny their undeniable truth. Letters from home, permitted through the Red Cross, only deepened the confusion. Liesl received a note, scribbled in shaky handwriting from her mother, who vividly described scavenging for turnips in bombed-out fields and wrapping herself in rags to keep warm. Her mother's unspoken envy subtly slipped through the ink. Asterisk if they feed you, then you are fortunate. Asterisk Liesl read it aloud in the dim light, her throat tightening as the others listened intently. Their own captivity suddenly seemed a cruel blessing compared to the desperate ruins their families endured. The Americans, perhaps without explicitly intending to, continued to unravel the women's fragile certainty. They provided regular medical checks, distributing aspirin for fevers and clean bandages for cuts. One guard, noticing Anna's lingering cough, brought her a wool scarf, folded neatly, offering it with no questions asked. She pressed it to her face, inhaling the clean smell of detergent, and tears welled in her eyes. This was not how enemies behaved. This was not how the war was supposed to end. The greatest shock came during an interrogation session. Liesl was summoned, her heart pounding against her ribs, fearing she would be accused of crimes she had never committed. The officer who questioned her, a man in his 30s with sharp, intelligent eyes, asked simple things. Where she had worked, what documents she had typed, whether she had observed any troop movements. His tone was steady, not harsh, and when she struggled for words, he patiently waited. At the end, instead of threats or accusations, he offered her water. She drank with shaking hands, utterly unable to believe that an interrogation could taste of such unexpected mercy. Returning to the barracks, she recounted her experience to the others. He treated me as if I were human. The silence that followed her words was more powerful than any shout could have been. The women began to compare notes, each new story subtly contradicting everything they had believed. Marta spoke of overhearing two guards joking about baseball, a game she could not understand but recognized as utterly harmless. Anna described how one soldier had courteously bent down to retrieve her dropped spoon, handing it back with a simple, respectful nod. These were not grand gestures, but their very ordinariness relentlessly dismantled years of ingrained propaganda. The women had been told to expect brutality, humiliation, and yet they consistently received courtesy. That courtesy was, in its own way, harder to endure than cruelty, because cruelty would have merely confirmed their deepest fears. Courtesy, instead, forced them to profoundly re-examine everything. At night, their conversations circled endlessly. Was this real? Would it last? Liesl argued that perhaps it was only temporary, a clever mask hiding true, malicious intentions. Marta countered that no mask could possibly last so long without slipping. Anna confessed that she no longer knew what to believe, and her raw confession was met with nods of weary, communal agreement. Each day brought not answers, but deeper, more tormenting questions, and in those questions lay the true agony of their captivity. And still life pressed forward. Meals continued with steady regularity. Roll calls passed without incident. The guards' politeness did not falter. Slowly, the women felt their bodies healing, but their hearts twisted in a complex knot of uncertainty. Marta, gazing through the wire at the distant horizon one evening, murmured, "We are prisoners, yet I feel freer here than I did in the Reich." Liesl turned sharply, whispering, "Don't say that." But deep in her chest, she felt the undeniable truth of it burning. Then came the small moment that would lodge in their collective memory forever. One afternoon, as the women were escorted across the compound, they heard music drifting from a radio in the guards' quarters. The tune was swing, bright and playful, utterly foreign to their ears after years of marching songs and solemn anthems. The guards tapped their feet, grinning at the infectious rhythm, and for a fleeting instant, the women felt the world open wider than their prison fences. It was not the sound of conquerors mocking the defeated. It was simply life, vibrant and unbroken, spilling unexpectedly into their captivity. Anna laughed, a short, startled sound, and instinctively covered her mouth as if laughter itself were forbidden. The guards turned, surprised, but said nothing. That night, lying in their bunks, the women whispered about the music. Marta admitted she could not stop humming the tune, though she did not know the words. Liesl confessed that the melody made her chest ache with something she could not quite name. Anna whispered, "If monsters make music like that, then maybe monsters don't exist." The others fell silent, profoundly unsettled by her words, for they hinted at a truth none dared admit aloud. Their entire world was turning upside down. The next morning, the routine resumed, as if nothing had changed. Yet within the women, something profound had shifted. Kindness was no longer an anomaly. It was a persistent, undeniable pattern. And with each smile, each meal, each unexpected gesture, the internal conflict deepened, not between guards and prisoners, but within the prisoners themselves. They were no longer sure who they were. Their enemies were, or what it truly meant to be held captive. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the compound, Liesl stood at the fence, watching an American guard adjust his helmet with an almost absent-minded ease. Her heart twisted within her chest, caught in the painful vice between the fierce hatred she had been rigorously taught and a confounding gratitude she found impossible to suppress. Behind her, Marta's voice was a hushed whisper. "If they are not the monsters we feared, then what does that make us?" The question lingered in the cool evening air, heavier than barbed wire, sharper than rifle sights, waiting for an answer none of them yet dared to speak aloud. The morning sun spilled gold across the camp, glinting off the barbed wire, and throwing the elongated shadows of the watchtowers across the gravel pathways. By now, the routines had become undeniably familiar. Roll call, a simple breakfast, the assignment of work details. But what unsettled the women most was not the soul-numbing monotony of their days. It was the stark absence of everything they had been conditioned to expect. No fists slammed into ribs. No jeering laughter mocked their every step. Instead, there was an unexpected structure, a surprising degree of courtesy, and a rhythm of life that felt more stable, more predictable, than anything left in the crumbling ruins of Germany. For Liesl, Marta, and Anna, every passing day pressed them deeper into a contradiction that gnawed at the very edges of their core beliefs. The Reich had promised them grotesque monsters. Reality had presented them with men who offered polite nods and coffee steaming in tin mugs. One afternoon, while scrubbing laundry in basins set up near the barracks, the women overheard a pair of guards talking in low, easy voices. Their words were foreign, an incomprehensible murmur, but the tone was unmistakable. Easy laughter, jokes shared in the sunshine. Then came something more profoundly shocking. One guard, a wide grin spreading across his face, reached into his pocket and pulled out a stick of chewing gum. He offered it to Marta, who froze instantly, soap dripping from her hands. Suspicion warred fiercely with a rising tide of curiosity, but the guard's expression held no mockery, only a casual, unassuming generosity. With trembling fingers, she accepted the strange offering. The texture was peculiar, the sweetness startling her palate. She chewed slowly, cautiously, until the sheer absurdity of the moment cracked something open inside her. All her life, she had been told Americans would spit on her. Instead, one had given her candy. She laughed aloud, a raw, startled sound that made the other women glance up in surprise. The propaganda posters flashed in her mind, grim caricatures of leering GIs, grotesque and dangerous. Yet here, in flesh and blood, stood a man who had offered her sugar instead of a slap. The posters seemed suddenly childish, like nightmares scribbled by a frightened child. Marta's laugh turned into a choked sob, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, horrified by the tumultuous emotions colliding within her. The guard, not understanding, simply shrugged and went on humming a tuneless melody. Anna, still fragile but visibly stronger now, studied every gesture of the soldiers with wide, searching eyes. She remembered the speeches broadcast over crackling radios. Americans were decadent, immoral, brutal. But when she accidentally dropped her blanket in the mud one evening, it was an American guard who bent to pick it up, carefully brushing off the grime before handing it back. The kindness was so small, so ordinary, that it struck her harder than any fiery speech. She carried the blanket back into the barracks, clutching it tightly to her chest, whispering, "They lied to us." The others heard her, but for once no one offered a correction. The collapse of certainty began to spread, like invisible cracks through glass. Liesl fought hardest against this insidious erosion of belief. She repeated the resonant words of her father, a man who had died believing fiercely in duty, who had told her never to trust an enemy's smile. She clung to that warning like a shield, her last piece of armor. Yet every day the armor grew heavier, cumbersome. When she was summoned again for questioning, she braced herself for cruelty, for intimidation. Instead, the officer offered her a chair, listened patiently to her answers, and concluded the interview with a simple, respectful thank you. That phrase, so ordinary, so utterly respectful, lodged itself deep in her chest. She walked back to the barracks, profoundly shaken, feeling as though she had somehow betrayed her father by simply surviving an act of kindness. The women whispered at night, their voices weaving through the darkness. Marta admitted she could no longer reconcile the terrifying enemy she had been taught to fear with the tangible one she now faced. Anna confessed she dreamed of the music she had heard on the guard's radio. Music full of laughter instead of rage. Liesl tried to silence them, insisting it was all a calculated strategy, a performance designed to break their will. But even as she spoke, doubt coiled in her gut. Could such casual humanity truly be staged? The evidence continued to mount. The Red Cross arrived for inspections, their officials walking through the camp with serious notebooks and an aura of calm authority. They spoke to the women, meticulously ensuring they were properly fed, clothed, and housed. The very presence of these international witnesses shattered the last expectation of secret brutality. If cruelty was to happen, surely it would not be paraded before outsiders. Instead, the women realized the Americans wanted the world to see their discipline, their adherence to protocol. That thought unsettled them in ways starvation never could. For Marta, the turning point came with illness. She developed a fever, her body shivering uncontrollably in the night. Terrified she would be left to simply die, she mentally prepared herself for neglect. But a guard noticed her weakness during roll call and, instead of ignoring it, summoned a medic. Within hours, she was given aspirin, a clean blanket, and a place to rest in a warmer barack. She recovered within days, stunned not just by the medicine, but by the simple, undeniable fact that an enemy had chosen to save her. Lying awake afterward, she whispered into the dark, "If this is war, then what was peace?" The profound irony of their situation was certainly not lost on them. Letters from home still described widespread hunger, pervasive fear, and utter chaos. Their families dug through rubble for scraps, while they, the prisoners, were fed bacon and bread. Anna read one letter aloud, her voice trembling as her mother described neighbors collapsing in the streets from malnutrition. The barracks fell silent as the women stared at their trays, guilt cutting deeper than any gratitude they felt. Captivity had become not a punishment but a strange reprieve, and that realization cut against everything they had been indoctrinated to expect. One evening, a guard attempted to teach a few prisoners how to say simple English words. He pointed at objects, bread, water, blanket, and repeated them until the women echoed them clumsily. The exercise quickly turned awkwardly comic, laughter rising despite the underlying tension. For a brief, fleeting moment, they were not prisoners and captors, but simply human beings sharing syllables across a vast gulf of language. When Marta stumbled over the word coffee, the guard chuckled warmly and clapped once, as if applauding a child's effort. She flushed, embarrassed, yet strangely warmed by his reaction. Later, lying awake, she whispered, "They treat us as if we matter." No one disagreed. The propaganda that had girded them for years now felt like a crumbling fortress. Every smile, every ration, every humane gesture was a hammer blow to its formidable walls. And yet, surrendering to this new truth was terrifying. To admit they had been deceived meant admitting they had lived in a world built on lies, that the sacrifices of their families, the tragic deaths of fathers and brothers, had been wrapped in cruel illusions. Liesl clung hardest to her resistance, insisting to the others that the Americans' kindness was merely temporary, a deceptive mask that would inevitably fall away. But each day her words rang hollower, even in her own ears. The breaking point arrived quietly during evening roll call as rain drizzled softly across the compound. One guard, without a word, offered Anna an umbrella to shield her shivering body. She stared at him, disbelief etched into her face. The image pierced through her like lightning. An enemy, armed and uniformed, holding out not a weapon but an act of shelter. She accepted it, her hands trembling, and for the very first time since her capture, she smiled without fear. The other women saw it, and in that fragile smile lay the unspoken acknowledgement of a truth none could ignore any longer. Yet this acceptance brought no comfort. If the enemy was not the monster, then what had they been fighting for? If kindness came from the very hands they had been told would destroy them, then what did that say about those who had demanded their unquestioning loyalty? The questions deepened, echoing louder than any sermon, and the answers threatened to undo the very core of who they believed they were. As the barracks settled into silence that night, Liesl stared at the ceiling, her fists clenched, whispering to herself the rigid words of her father. But they no longer sounded like immutable truth. They sounded like hollow echoes. And just before sleep claimed her, she admitted what terrified her most. The enemy was teaching her how to hope again. The summer air grew warmer as weeks turned into months, and with the change in season came a profound change inside the women themselves. The fences still loomed, the watchtowers still stood sentinel, but the crushing weight of fear no longer pressed as heavily upon them. Instead, something stranger had taken its place. Gratitude tangled inextricably with shame, comfort laced with an unsettling guilt. They had entered the camp believing they would be broken. Instead, they found themselves mended in ways they could not have possibly predicted. Each day brought reminders that the war was over. Yet, its ghosts lingered persistently in the letters from home. Liesl received word that her mother had bartered her last family heirloom for a mere sack of flour, while Marta's cousin described entire neighborhoods reduced to desolate rubble. Anna's village wrote of sickness spreading virulently among children who had not seen milk in months. Reading these stark words by the dim barracks light, the women realized the cruelest irony. They, the prisoners, were better fed, cleaner, and undeniably safer than the loved ones they longed desperately to return to. The guilt of that truth pressed on their chests like a stone they could not dislodge. And yet, within the camp, life unexpectedly offered a strange dignity. Guards would tip their helmets respectfully as the women passed. Meals remained steady, sometimes even generous, with a piece of fruit or a dollop of jam added to their trays. When Anna's persistent cough worsened again, a medic listened attentively to her chest, prescribing rest and hot broth. She recovered within days, whispering afterward that she felt guilty for surviving more comfortably in captivity than her neighbors did in freedom. Liesl snapped at her, "Don't say that," but her voice cracked, betraying the immense strain of holding together a world that no longer made any discernible sense. Small acts began to stitch themselves into memory more tightly than any orders or lectures ever had. One afternoon, a guard set a gramophone near the mess hall, filling the camp with the jaunty sounds of swing music. The women gathered near the barracks windows, listening as the cheerful rhythms carried across the gravel and barbed wire. Marta hummed along without meaning to, tapping her fingers against her thigh. She had not realized how much silence had dominated her ears until music cracked it open. "It sounds like laughter," Anna said softly, and the others nodded in silent agreement, though none wanted to admit how deeply it unsettled them to find joy echoing from the enemy's machine. The propaganda that had once been their armor now felt like flimsy rags. They had been told the Americans would strip them of dignity. Instead, dignity was subtly returned in small, incremental doses. A blanket tucked properly, a name spoken without malice, a simple wave offered in the rain. Those gestures were not grand, but they were profoundly corrosive to the elaborate structure of lies. The women no longer feared beatings. Instead, they feared the hollow space left behind when their certainty dissolved. If the enemy could be kind, what did that say about those who had demanded their blind loyalty at home? The definitive turning point came in late July when a group of the women were taken to work in nearby fields under American supervision. The day was hot, the sky a blazing blue, and the soil rich with crops that had not been bombed into dust. They bent to their tasks, hands deep in the earth, when a farmer approached them with baskets of freshly picked apples. He handed them out with a warm smile, his children peeking shyly from behind him. The women froze, stunned at being treated not as criminals, but as workers worthy of refreshment. Marta bit into her apple, juice running down her chin, and closed her eyes against the surprising sweetness. In that single bite, she tasted not only fruit, but the shattering collapse of years of indoctrination. That night, lying in her bunk, Marta whispered, "If this is defeat, perhaps it is gentler than victory." Liesl wanted to argue, to counter, but the words faltered on her lips. She had carried her father's warnings like sacred commandments, but each day they felt more like shadows dissolving in an encroaching light. The enemy had become less terrifying than the unsettling silence of her own thoughts. Anna murmured, "Maybe kindness is stronger than fear," and for once, neither of the others corrected her. By autumn, rumors of release were whispered tentatively among them. Some prisoners were already being sent home. The prospect filled the women with both a surge of hope and a profound sense of dread. They longed to return, yet deeply feared the desolate ruins awaiting them. More than that, they wondered how they could possibly explain what they had seen, what they had experienced. How could they tell families still starving in cellars that the Americans had given them bacon and blankets? How could they speak of politeness and unexpected courtesy when others remembered only firestorms and destruction? To carry home the truth was to risk disbelief, even scorn, and yet that truth clung to them like a second skin they could not shed. On the morning of their transfer, the women were assembled near the camp gate. Their belongings were few, simple. Blankets neatly folded, letters tucked carefully into pockets, bars of soap kept like cherished relics. The guards stood ready, some smiling faintly in farewell. One soldier, the very same who had once offered Anna chocolate, tipped his helmet again, a gesture so simple yet so heavy with unspoken meaning. Anna met his eyes, her face calm and clear, and for the first time she did not look away. She whispered, "Danke," knowing he likely understood. The sound of her gratitude was quiet, almost ethereal, but it carried like thunder in her companions' hearts. As the truck pulled away, rattling over the gravel, the women looked back. The camp receded, the barbed wire thinning into the distance, but the memory of it would never leave. They had come expecting brutality. They departed with the immense weight of kindness, a burden more disorienting than any physical chains. In the silence of that ride, each carried a question she could not yet answer. If the enemy could be gentle, then what was the true measure of all they had sacrificed? For years afterward, many of them would recall those weeks not as a period of humiliation, but as the first time they truly glimpsed another way of living. Discipline without cruelty, power without hatred. Some would write of it in journals, secret confessions. Others would speak of it to children who could not possibly imagine the pervasive fear that had once consumed them. And though they returned to a broken Germany, they carried within them the undeniable witness of something greater than propaganda, the simple, resilient truth that humanity had outlived the war. Yet, even as the truck rolled closer to home, a new, subtle conflict began. To survive kindness was one thing. To live with its indelible memory in a land still poisoned by bitterness was another entirely. The women sat together, shoulders touching lightly, their eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Behind them, the camp faded into memory. Ahead lay ruins and hunger, and between those two stark worlds, they carried a fragile flame of belief that perhaps, against all odds, gentleness could endure.